Sonny was standing on the edge of the ivory island, looking at the sky above. The marvelous mimic was behind him, still pretending to be a quaint brick cottage. The cottage stood between the grove and the lake, on the empty stretch of emerald grass to the side of the Great Pagoda. The area was quite peaceful, and the view from his window was usually no less spectacular than it had been in Bastion. Of course, that peacefulness was deceiving. The ivory island was high in the air. Far below it, the arm of the dead god lay heavily on the ashen ground. A long bridge was connecting the humerus and the radius, which had broken off eons ago. The bridge had been recently built, and currently, a vast column of warriors was marching across it, ready to enter Godgrave. A sea of vermilion banners fluttered above like blood. The sight of the great army of the Sword Domain was quite daunting. There were hundreds of thousands of awakened, numerous masters, and dozens of exalted saints. Such a force had never been gathered in the history of humankind, or of the waking world at least. There were countless mundane humans too, following the warriors in the vast train of the army. Funnily enough, this great force had not been assembled to fight against nightmare creatures or other horrors of the dream realm. It had been assembled to wage war against a similar human army that was currently somewhere far away on the other side of the titanic skeleton, scaling its right arm. In any case, Sonny was not looking down on the sword army. Instead, he was looking at the sky. The sky had been blue and clear not too long ago, but now it was being slowly devoured by gray clouds. They were finally crossing the realm boundary. Soon, an annihilating white radiance would suffuse the incandescent heavens and spell fiery doom for anyone caught directly in its light. He sighed. It did not feel safe at all to be invading Godgrave atop a flying island. No matter how powerful its enchantments were, the ivory island was enormous and immensely heavy. Due to inertia, it would not be able to stop instantly should the veil of clouds break, which meant that all of them would become ash. What a way to start a war. Technically, the war had already begun. The official declaration had happened soon after Ivory Island left Bastion, almost a month ago. Back then, Nephis and Cassia had been summoned to the waking world. Sonny had been invited as well, albeit as the Lord of Shadows, not the memory purveyor of the Firekeepers. There was a historic meeting in the stronghold of Clan Valor in NQSC. All the saints of the Sword Domain were present, as well as the heads of those vassal clans that did not possess a transcendent member at the moment. What made it historic, though, was not the illustrious company. It was the fact that the King of Swords himself attended. Sonny was quite shocked when the doors opened and a heavy presence suddenly settled in the opulent hall, forcing even the most powerful saints to grow stiff and quiet. Of course, his face was hidden behind Weaver's mask, so no one was the wiser. They were seated around a vast round table, which it seemed had been carved from the trunk of a single enormous tree. The table held some significance, without a doubt. Perhaps it was that tree in particular that had been the source of the abominable forest slain by Anvil of Valor in the past. In any case, there was an empty seat next to Morgan. Sonny guessed that maybe it had been left empty in honor of Saint Madoc, her uncle. But he was proven wrong. As the vast presence enveloped the hall, there was the sound of heavy steps, and a tall man in dark armor entered, a vermilion cloak draped around his shoulders. The man was naturally imposing, in a way that made others cower. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a mighty build. His eyes were gray and cold like tempered steel, their gaze oppressive enough to make one shudder. His hair was black, and a full beard obscured the lower part of his austere face. Despite that, it was impossible to miss how noble and distinguished it was. The man was supposed to be close to 50, but did not look a day older than 30. However, the most striking thing about him was not his height, his build, or his cold gray eyes. It was not even the oppressive force of his unfathomable boundless presence. It was something invisible and intangible, an otherworldly quality that forced one to look at him, pay attention to him, and want to kneel in front of him. This was Anvil, the King of Swords. Sunny had only seen him once before from afar. He was still unsure what barriers there were that prevented the sovereigns from visiting the waking world often, and what was the cost of breaking them. All he knew was that today the king had decided to descend into the mortal world. The rest of the meeting was like a blur. Anvil did not waste a lot of time, speaking in a calm and concise manner, as if the very concept of wasting words was offensive to him. It did not seem like he was trying to explain something to the gathered powerhouses or wish to persuade them. Instead, he was simply stating his will. His message was clear. The rulers of the Song domain had conspired to kill his daughter, and therefore to harm the Sword domain. Therefore, he would assemble an army to march on Ravenheart and tear down Kisong's throne. And those present, as his vassals, would become that army. Sunny was so caught up in the solemn atmosphere and the irresistible authority hiding in Anvil's deep voice that he almost missed how ironic the whole thing was. After all, there was the Han Li clan somewhere out there still. That was the clan from which Castor, who had been sent to the Forgotten Shore to kill Nephis, hailed from. The orders to eliminate her in the Dream Realm had most likely come from the King of Swords. But now, the very same king was proclaiming war on the pretense of punishing someone else for trying to assassinate her. Sunny glanced at Nephis, wondering if she would show any reaction. And indeed, she did. While everyone remained silent, either in agreement with the king or too wary of his power to raise a futile objection, she was the only one who spoke. Nephis advocated against the war. Her voice was even, and her expression was poised. She calmly listed all the reasons why a war would be disastrous for both domains and asked her adopted father to reconsider. Morgan seemed amused by the whole sequence of events, while the rest of those gathered in the hall kept their faces neutral. In the end, Neff's words were meaningless. Anvil dismissed her objection with one glance and a few cold sentences. Everyone here knew that there was no point in trying to defy the sovereign's will. Nephis, of course, knew it best of all. The reason she had spoken out was not a sincere hope that the war could be avoided. Instead, it was important to do so for an entirely different reason. There had to be a record of her objecting to Anvil's decision. There had to be rumors that Changing Star of the Immortal Flame Clan had been against the bloodshed, the waste of human life, and the ghastly ugliness of the civil war between humans from the very start. Even if it was all to avenge her against those who had conspired to kill her, those rumors were needed to pave a way for her to slay both her adopted father and Kisong, and then usurp their thrones without being branded as a tyrant. When the time came, she had to be welcomed as a savior instead. Sunny smiled behind his mask. What a treacherous world we live in. Not long after that, the Sword domain declared war on the Song domain. The news was broadcast in the waking world, as well as announced by heralds in the cities of the Dream Realm. Both worlds seemed to explode. Sunny was far away from civilization and too busy to observe the immediate reaction of the people, but it must have been intense. In an instant, the very foundation of the world was shaken. The government tried to handle the situation somehow, but it was powerless against the influence of the great clans. People in the waking world were terrified and paralyzed by shock. So were many in the Dream Realm. There were plenty of those who welcomed the news, though, having been prepared by meticulous propaganda to feel exactly that way. On both sides, many were burning with militant zeal and thirsting to punish the enemy. and so 2 great armies were gathered and marched to war. It did not happen in a day, but it also did not take a lot of time. The preparations of the 2 sovereigns had been extensive. Today, finally, the Sword Army was ready to enter Godgrave. As Sonny watched the sky, there was the sound of light steps behind him. Then Nephis approached and stopped by his side, clad in a suit of lustrous steel armor. She looked at him and smiled. Despite the sinister clouds above and the vast army marching to a calamitous war below, he couldn't help but feel his heart race at the sight of that smile. Sonny had read somewhere that people often described this feeling as having butterflies in their stomach. The image of a swarm of dark butterflies tearing at the walls of his stomach seemed more dreadful than romantic, so he really doubted the literary sense of those people. But still, even though a month had passed since their first kiss, he still felt excitement every time he saw her. It was odd and improper to feel so blessed on the eve of a disastrous war. But he did. Life was strange that way. A smile appeared on his face as well. "Do you have enough spare time to visit a humble enchanter today, Lady Nephis?" She lingered for a moment, then shrugged. "I might have a little time." With that, she turned her head and looked at the sky as well. "Are you worried about the sun?" Sonny nodded slowly. "I am indeed a little nervous. Do you think that the clouds will hold until we land?" Nephis inhaled deeply. "Someone will make sure that they do. In fact, she should be arriving any moment now, actually." Sonny raised an eyebrow. Then a subtle spark ignited in his eyes. There was the sound of fluttering wings, and a vast shadow fell on the emerald grass. A moment later, a woman was standing in front of them. She was tall and slender, with long hair that fell down like a cascade of pale gold. Her posture was perfectly straight, and her cold face was dazzlingly beautiful. The woman was wearing a suit of light steel armor, with pauldrons and greaves decorated with stylized feathers. The gaze of her stern amber eyes was piercing and heavy, and a white cloak hung on her back, embroidered with silver thread. Saint Tyrus had not changed at all. Sonny was glad to see her. Of course, he hid his happiness behind a mask of respectful unfamiliarity. Skytide bowed slightly. "Lady Changing Star." Nephis nodded. "Saint Tyrus." The two weren't very close to each other, but they had a good relationship due to what had happened during the Battle of the Black Skull. In fact, there was probably no saint among the vassals of Clan Valor with a deeper bond to Nephis than Skytide. Her clan was also different from how it used to be. Its status was still far from being favored by the king. But now that Roan had transcended, there were 2 saints among the members of the clan. There were few legacy families who could boast the same, so that alone made it impossible to ignore or oppress Whitefeather. Much more importantly, Skytide's status soared now that the war was imminent. Her power over winds and clouds made her one of the most valuable people in Godgrave, which was a sword that cut both ways. She was indispensable for the rulers of the sword domain, and therefore they were forced to treat her nicely now. On the other hand, she was one of the primary targets for the forces of the song domain, so Sonny was more than a little bit worried about her. Nephis, meanwhile, nodded curtly in his direction. "This is Master Sunless, an enchanter employed by the Firekeepers." Saint Tyrus looked at him expressionlessly, then frowned a little. "Master Sunless, your name sounds familiar. Ah, had my daughter commissioned a memory from you?" He bowed politely. "Indeed, I had the privilege of fulfilling a request made by Awakened Tell once." Skytide's expression did not change, but he could swear that her eyes turned a little warmer.
I see. That memory is serving my husband well. Your competence is worthy of praise, Master Sunless.
With that, she seemed to forget about his existence and looked at Nephis.
The realm boundary is close. How long will it take the Ivory Island to reach the target area?
Nephis answered neutrally.
Around an hour at top speed. Will you be able to hold out for that long if need be?
Skytide glanced at the gray sky, lingered for a moment, then nodded.
I will. I won't be able to assist with anything else, though.
The immolating sky was not the only threat that waited for them in Godgrave. It was the most dire one, though, so everything else was beside the point. Nephis gestured for St. Tyrus to follow her and headed for the ivory tower.
We will handle the rest. Allow me to guide you.
As they were walking away, she threw a poignant look at Sunny. He smiled and nodded subtly, telling her not to worry about him. As Master Sunless, he was not supposed to participate in any battles, so he could only observe today. It was a strange situation to be in, but he could not complain. There would be plenty of battles for him to fight before too long anyway, perhaps more than he could handle, even with his 7 bodies. Letting out a heavy sigh, Sunny turned to the edge of the island and looked down. At some point, the door of the marvelous mimic opened, and Eiko walked out, yawning as she looked around with sleepy eyes. Noticing him, the petite girl floated off the porch and flew around the cottage, eventually landing on the grass near the edge. She looked down and made a face.
Damn, boss. There's so many of them. So many potential clients.
Sunny gave her a dark look.
Cover your arms.
Despite the seriousness of the situation, Eiko was wearing mundane clothes, and not even formal ones at that. Her black t-shirt had some kind of nightmare creature printed on it with a band name written above in bold letters, which wasn't really a problem except for the fact that the intricate tattoo of a snake that coiled around her right arm was almost fully revealed. She grinned sheepishly and summoned a green memory tunic. Sunny hesitated, then said quietly,
Are you sure you don't want me to bring you away to the waking world?
Eiko looked up at him and blinked a few times.
And miss all the fun? I mean, miss such a historic event? No thanks. Plus, I know these guys well. Don't worry, boss. They'll be fine. They've survived worse.
He stared at her for a few moments, wondering if she would change her mind after witnessing Godgrave. In the end, he didn't say anything. Together, they watched as the shoulder of the colossal skeleton grew closer and closer. The Ivory Island accelerated, leaving the ascending army far behind. Soon, the sky was entirely hidden by a veil of clouds, and the air grew warmer, the daylight changing subtly. They were heading for the collarbone of the dead deity, where the base camp of the Sword Army was supposed to be established, and they, the Firekeepers, were meant to be vanguard of the human invasion into Godgrave. Their task was not only to clear out the nightmare creatures populating the area and serve as a bulwark that protected the slow advance of the army from the arm of the titanic skeleton. What they had to do was much more important. It was bring the authority of the King of Swords and the power of his domain to this cursed land. Soon, the vast range of the ancient collarbone was beneath them. The ground was white, but there was barely any of it visible under the thick carpet of scarlet growth. Moss, grass, and grotesque towering plants were all red, as if bloody marrow had exploded from the cracks and fissures in the ancient bone. Of course, the Vermilion jungle was teeming with all kinds of abominable creatures, all moving and devouring each other in a mad rush to live and grow in the unknown, but inevitably fleeting amount of time before the veil of cloud broke and the merciless sun burned them all to ash. At such a late stage of infestation, the surface of the dead god's collarbone was not much safer than the dark expanse of the hollows where the true horrors dwelt. The strange nightmare creatures populating Godgrave would have had enough time to grow immensely strong, reaching the corrupted or great rank en masse. The strongest would have already retreated underground to try and claim a place for themselves away from the annihilating heavens, but many still remained. And now, all their undivided attention was turned to the beautiful island drifting below the clouds. Usually, these abominations would have felt nothing but fear when looking at the terrible sky. But today, perhaps, for the first time in countless years, they felt something else. A hunger so deep that it drove them into a state of frenzy. Immediately, the scarlet jungle seemed to boil. Numerous abominations rushed in the direction of the descending island like a morbid tide. Most of them simply ran, slithered, or crawled, but there were those capable of soaring into the air as well. A vast swarm of nightmare creatures rose from the ground to meet the ivory island. It seemed inevitable that the flying citadel would be swallowed by the cloud of them. But then, an imperceptible change spread through the world. Sonny's eyes narrowed when he recognized the familiar feeling. Another component of the ivory tower was unleashed, and suddenly, it was as if a wave of invisible force crashed into the rising abominations, throwing them down or outright obliterating their hideous bodies. Blood spilled from the sky like crimson rain. The tyrannical crushing had come to Godgrave, reaping countless lives in the first culling of the Great Domain War. The crushing descended upon Godgrave, flattening a vast swath of the vermilion jungle and pressing the nightmare creatures into the white surface of the ancient bone. Its reach was a magnitude smaller than it had been in the ruins of the Kingdom of Hope, but its force was just as tyrannical. The winged abominations that had been rising toward the flying island were either obliterated or thrown to the ground. A deluge of blood rained down, and only the strongest and most resilient of the flying horrors managed to stay in the air. They persisted stubbornly, their eyes full of demented frenzy. There were terrifying aerial behemoths among them, and nimble creatures that zipped around on swift, translucent wings. A moment later, the first arrow streaked down, hitting one of the larger abominations in the eye and obliterating half of its hideous head. Sonny looked at the macabre spectacle, feeling his blood boil with a familiar thrill. He had never thought that he would grow accustomed to the ghastly crucible of battle one day, but here he was, acting as if he was addicted to it. He longed to join the bloodshed, but he could not allow himself to. It was the strangest thing. He could see the fire keepers, who were spread out along the edge of the island, drawing their bows. Some of them were better archers than others, but each and every one was proficient enough with the bow and arrow to be a lethal presence on the battlefield. Their memories were all top-notch as well, not only because they had gathered a vast arsenal of them during the long years of defending humanity from the horrors of the nightmare spell, but also because Sonny had personally tinkered with their equipment in the last month. On top of that, all these memories were being enhanced by the crown of dawn that Nephis wore. A barrage of enchanted arrows, unleashed by 7 ascended cohorts, was a dire sight to behold. The winged nightmare creatures that had endured the crushing were simply erased from existence, chunks of flesh raining on the scarlet jungle below. Only one remained, an enormous beast with wings wide enough to drown the world in their shade. Its frenzied eyes were burning with chilling malice, and its pale brown hide was dotted with dozens of arrows, none of which managed to pierce it deep enough to deal substantial damage. The winds groaned as they were torn apart by its mighty wings. Before the monstrous creature could rise any higher, though, a single fiery arrow streaked down from the top of the ivory tower, piercing its head clean through. Wisps of white flame escaped from inside its cracked skull. The massive abomination lost momentum, rolled in the air, and started to fall down. The ivory island was plummeting from the overcast sky, descending lower and lower. The closer to the ground it got, the more the jungle was affected by the crushing. Many of the nightmare creatures that had been pressed down into the red moss were now flattened into piles of bloody flesh, sharp shards of bone protruding through the broken skin. Most were powerful enough to survive, though. Finally, the speed of the flying island's descent started to reduce. It was still great, nevertheless, almost uncontrollable, as if the people on the island were in a rush to reach the ground. And they were, because the sky above them was suffused with blinding glow, and only a thin veil of clouds stood between them and inescapable annihilation.
Brace!
When the shouts spread among the firekeepers, Sonny gracefully lowered himself to one knee and put one hand on the grass. Eiko simply floated in the air, hovering above the ground. In the next moment, the ivory island crashed heavily into the white surface of the ancient bone. The dead god's collarbone quaked, and a violent shockwave obliterated a vast stretch of the vermilion jungle in the vicinity of the impact zone. The 7 chains hanging from the ivory island rattled as they struck the ground. The lake, resting on its surface, rippled, spilling over its shores, and the chain breaker swayed on the tall waves. The ivory island came to rest, laying tilted on the white expanse of ancient bone. The crushing dissipated. Down below, countless nightmare creatures moved, rising from the ground, their bloodshot eyes focused on the figures of the firekeepers, looking at them from above. The cloud of debris, raised into the air by the impact, had not settled yet when they started to move, flowing toward the invading island from all sides. However, the firekeepers were moving too. The closest to Sonny was Sid, who had been Neff's driver on the day of the assassination attempt. Clad in light armor and armed with a sword and shield, she stepped up to the edge and looked at the tide of abominations with a grin. Then, before the sparks of light swirling around her head manifested into a helmet, she raised her sword and kissed the flat of its blade.
Here we go.
Letting out a battle cry, she jumped down, the plume of her helmet fluttering in the wind. All along the edge, those firekeepers who were proficient in melee were doing the same. Those who excelled in ranged combat, as well as those who usually played a supportive role, stayed above, continuing to send arrows and sorceress attacks into the tide of nightmare creatures. Soon, the fastest of the abominations reached the vicinity of the island and clashed with the advancing firekeepers. Sharp steel hissed as it cut into flesh. More blood spilled on the sun-bleached surface of the ancient bone. Sonny observed the battle with burning eyes. The familiar cacophony assaulted his ears, and he felt his hands itching. Nevertheless, he remained where he was, playing the role of a non-combatant. Before the firekeepers could drown in the tide of nightmare creatures, a radiant figure shot from the balcony at the top of the ivory tower, falling down like an incandescent meteor. Nephis landed in the thick of the abominable horde, and in the next moment, a blinding explosion bloomed above the bone plain. A wave of incinerating flame spread outward from the point of impact, turning countless nightmare creatures to ash. The firekeepers cheered, welcoming their personal deity to the battlefield. Looking from above, Sonny let out a long sigh. To hell with it. Then he took control of the gloomy shadow, and used Shadow Step to send that incarnation of his far away, under the cacophony of the Scarlet Jungle. Assuming a corporeal form there, he manifested the Onyx Mantle and summoned Weaver's Mask. Then, before any of the rushing nightmare creatures could lunge at him, he stepped through the shadows once again, appearing in the midst of the battlefield. An enormous, towering abomination was in front of him, raising its terrifying fists to deliver a crushing blow to the ground below. Reaching into the shadows, Sunny pulled an inky black Odachi out of them, and then lunged forward. A dark line was suddenly drawn on the massive body of the nightmare creature. It froze for a moment, its fists still raised above its head, and then, slowly, fell apart, bisected down the middle with a single terrifying slash. Behind the abomination, a slender young woman with silver hair was revealed, holding a mirror-like sword. There was an expression of surprise on her beautiful face. Grinning behind the mask, Sunny gave her a small bow and said, his cold voice hiding a hint of dark glee, "Welcome to Godgrave, Lady Nephis." With that, he looked around. "I hope you don't mind the mess."
I think we're all going to die. What do you think, Rain?
Ray's voice was tinged with melancholy, but Rain had learned to ignore his complaints in the last few weeks. Sitting on the ground, well, on what served as ground in this godforsaken place, and leaning her back against a wagon's wheel, she gave him a relaxed shrug. The young man stared at her with indignation. After a while, he sighed.
Have enough decency to look concerned, at least.
They were currently in the middle of the army camp, resting after a long and arduous march. It was hard to tell what time of day it was, since there were no lights in Godgrave. A veil of clouds obscured the sky, shining with diffused radiance. It would have been quite pretty if it wasn't so terrifying. Everyone had been informed over and over again about the lethal nature of the sky in this land. They knew that the only way to survive in case the clouds parted was to remain absolutely still. The army had ascended to the dead god's arm far enough by now to fully cross the realm boundary, so those warnings were of vital importance. They had yet to see the clouds break, though. Rain, Tamar, Ray, and Fleur were among the awakened warriors of the 7th Legion, which was led by the 7th and last daughter of the Queen to reach transcendence, Saint Shan. Granted, Rain barely remembered how she ended up in such august company. So many things had happened in the last month that it was all like a blur. The news about the King of Swords declaring war on the Song Domain had reached them not long after reuniting with the members of the survey team in the main construction camp. It was a great shock to many, but not to Rain herself. The initial shock was soon replaced by fear and outrage. It was then that Queen Song left her palace in Ravenheart, appearing in public for the first time in many years. Rain did not witness it herself, but she was told that the Queen's speech was incredibly rousing. It ignited the hearts of the people of Song, so when the call to arms was issued, countless awakened warriors chose to answer. The vassals of the Queen responded to the call as well, gathering their armies to help defend the Song Domain against the tyranny of the King of Swords. Rain was one of those awakened warriors. She was made a soldier right there and then in the construction camp, as a member of Tamar and Sorrow's cohort. Tamar's father was leading his own war party, but he sent his daughters to serve under Song Seishan and her blood sisters. Rain wasn't entirely sure why, but she had no reason to complain. There were hundreds of thousands of awakened in the Song army, but only 7 royal legions. And although Saint Shan was the last among the 7 transcendent princesses to conquer the third nightmare, her personal power was in no way inferior to that of her sisters. So the 7th Legion was among the most elite forces in Godgrave, comparable to the Knights of Valor, led by Morgan, the Princess of War. Rain was honestly unsure how she had ended up here.
I guess that's the benefit of getting in through acquaintances.
The weeks between the declaration of war and today were incredibly hectic. So many things had happened, and yet one of them stood out as more bizarre than any other. It happened immediately after Rain joined the Song Army. She was woken up in the middle of the night by her teacher, who gestured for her to follow him quietly. Together, they left the busy camp and walked far into the wilderness, eventually reaching a secluded gorge. There, Rain had to stop and rub her eyes, bewildered by what she saw. Out there in the middle of the dream realm, a quaint brick cottage stood, illuminated by the pale light of the 3 moons. The sight was so strange that Rain assumed that she must be seeing things. However, she was not. There was really a neat cottage standing in the desolate wasteland of the Moon River Plain, a walking distance from the main camp of the road construction crew. It was not a mirage, and neither was it an ancient ruin. In fact, the brick building was neat and tidy, as if someone frequently swept its porch and washed down its windows. Rain looked at her teacher with wide eyes.
What is that?
He answered matter-of-factly,
That is an ascended devil pretending to be a cottage. Come inside.
She did not know what else to do but follow him into the cottage. The door opened by itself and then closed behind him. The interior looked like a dining hall of a small cafe. There was no one inside and no source of light except for the moonlight pouring through the windows. It was more than a little bit creepy. A moment later, the moonlight was extinguished as well, leaving Rain in absolute darkness.
Teacher?
There was a scratching sound, and a small light appeared in the darkness. Her teacher was standing near a shelf, holding a burning candle in his hand.
Come.
With that, he turned around and went back to the door. Rain had no idea why they had come inside only to leave with a candle, but she obediently followed. To her shock, however, the Moon River Plain was gone. When they came out, there were no moons, no stars, and no wind. The floor was perfectly flat, as if cut from black marble. She couldn't quite see where they were, but it felt as if they were underground. And there was someone else there as well.
God damn it, it's such a creepy boss. Boss, you're back. Where the hell did you... Huh? Who's that?
Rain had the same question. Out there in front of her, sitting on the black marble floor, there was a little girl who had a very dirty mouth and addressed her teacher as boss for some reason. Rain raised a hand and pointed to the strange child.
Who's the brat?
The little girl floated up, lowered her feet to the floor, and stared at her with wide eyes.
Brat? What do you mean, brat? I'm 28 years old.
Rain blinked a couple of times. She had assumed that the petite girl was a child, but now that she looked closer...
How embarrassing.
Rain looked down.
Oh, sorry, Auntie.
The petite girl opened her mouth in shock.
Auntie? No, wait, what do you mean by Auntie?
Listening to the two of them, her teacher let out a heavy sigh and shook his head.
To answer your questions, this is awakened Rain. This is awakened Eiko. Eiko, Rain is my disciple. Rain, Eiko is my assistant.
They turned to him almost simultaneously.
You have an assistant? You have a disciple?
Then they looked at each other, both wearing a similar shocked expression. Her teacher smiled.
No need to sound so stunned, really. Sure I do. Why wouldn't I? Now, the reason I brought you two here is to extend an offer to you both. Consider it a great honor."
His smile turned a little sinister, making both of them feel a bad premonition and shiver. His smile grew a little wider.
"How would you two ladies like to join the Shadow Clan?"
And that was how Rain ended up with an intricate snake tattoo coiling around her arm. Leaning on the wheel of a supply wagon, she closed her eyes and listened to Ray's complaints silently. The snake tattoo, which was apparently called the Mark of Shadows, was more than a simple tattoo, of course. It was akin to an attribute, granting her several useful abilities. Among them was the ability to see in absolute darkness, walk stealthily into the shadows, and sense their movements. It also helped her control her soul essence. Apart from that, the snake could also slither off her arm, manifesting into a weapon. Most importantly of all, at least according to her teacher, it allowed him, as well as the creature that had created the soul snake, access to her soul sea, which meant that they could defend it should something invade Rain's soul. She had not even known that there were things out there that could invade human souls, but knowing that her teacher would be there to deal with the invader made her feel better. All in all, the soul snake was an excellent gift to receive. Of course, it was not the only thing she had received from her teacher. The Mark of Shadows played an important role. It protected Rain and gave her a few useful abilities, but its main purpose was to confuse people. After all, she did not want anyone to learn that she did not have an aspect, and the snake tattoo bestowed upon her strange powers that could be seen as one. Her teacher had mentioned that he was working on something else to make her disguise more convincing as well. Rain did not know what he meant yet, but was going to learn one way or another in due time. What excited her the most was not the Mark of Shadows, though. It was the memories her teacher had given her. Oh, the joy and delight of having memories. Rain held a strong opinion that all the rest of the awakened in the world had no idea how good they had it. Her threadbare bodysuit and old clothes were gone, replaced by an enchanted armor. It was so soft and light that she did not feel any burden at all, but more resilient than her mundane equipment had ever been. The armor was made of dark gray fabric and lusterless black leather, fitting her perfectly. It was an awakened memory of the 5th tier. That was what she had been told, at least, called the Puppeteer's Shroud. Its enchantments increased her mental endurance and resistance against mind attack, as well as allowed her to recover from mental fatigue faster. The armor looked suspiciously similar to what her teacher used to wear, so she suspected that it had not been, in fact, crafted specifically for her. But even if the Puppeteer's Shroud was a hand-me-down, Rain did not mind. The euphoria of having a wonderful suit of incredibly light but resilient armor that adjusted to fit her body perfectly, cleaned and repaired itself, and could be summoned at any moment, was simply too great. It was the reward for slaying the awakened tyrant. There were 2 other memories that she had received from her teacher as well. One was a powerful bow made of green metal. In fact, Rain knew that metal all too well. It seemed that her teacher had smelted the blade of the huntsman's axe to forge the limbs of the bow, while the string was made from some strange black material. The bow was called the Beast of Prey, and was an awakened memory of the 3rd tier. Its enchantment allowed Rain to enhance the damage dealt by her arrows, as well as infuse one arrow with devastating force at the cost of most of her essence. However, the bow was also able to absorb and store her essence somehow, so with sufficient preparation, Rain could use the deadly shot twice. She received the Beast of Prey in exchange for the memory coupon her teacher had given her for slaying the huntsman. The 3rd memory she received, however, was a free bonus. It was a quiver of enchanted arrows that never seemed to run out. The arrows did not really possess any special qualities apart from the fact that their flight was absolutely noiseless. They were also incredibly sharp and could pierce thick armor. All in all, Rain was quite happy with her little arsenal. Of course, it was only the beginning. She expected to receive many more memories in the future. Sadly, her teacher seemed determined to only award her memories that fit her kills. He could have given her something much more powerful without a doubt, but then people would start asking questions about her identity. How could a newly awakened girl with no backing be walking around with a soul arsenal that put even the legacies to shame? That sort of thing.
Get up. Rest is over.
Tamar's voice drew Rain from her pleasant thoughts. Opening her eyes, she sighed and rose to her feet. All around them, the Song army was stirring. After ascending the right arm of the dead deity, they were finally ready to delve into the jungle growing on its white surface, and then cross to the colossal skeleton's collarbone. This rest stop was the last one they would be able to enjoy in relative safety. The edge of the jungle was somewhere ahead, a few kilometers from the head of the column. The 7th Legion was marching closer to its tail, so Rain could not see anything. Nevertheless, everyone was tense. That was because everyone knew that they were heading into battle. Not that people like Rain and the members of her cohort could do anything in a battle like that. From what they had heard in the last few days, the jungle had been allowed to grow for long enough that most nightmare creatures populating its depths were of the corrupted rank. Awakened warriors were simply not powerful enough to face them. Today, the battle was only for the Masters and the Saints, and for the abominations enthralled by Beastmaster. Just as Rain thought about it, a messenger arrived from the head of the column and hurried past them. She turned around and watched him disappear into the command tent of the Legion. Soon, several blood sisters emerged from it, and then their leader. Rain couldn't help but hold her breath when she saw the Queen's daughter. Saint Shan was a striking woman, without a doubt. With her strange but beautiful gray skin and tantalizing grace, she was like an embodiment of nobility and regal poise. She seemed both inhuman and riveting, but most of all, mysterious. Her beauty was truly breathtaking. It was to the point that the Blood Sisters, each an exquisitely beautiful woman herself, seemed plain and unassuming next to her. Rain still found it weird that most of the most powerful warriors of the Song domain were women, but she couldn't complain. Especially here in the 7th Legion, she sometimes felt that she was in a flower garden instead of an army. Granted, those flowers were roses with bloody thorns, and most of the rank and file soldiers were still men. Saint Shan led the ascended warriors of her legion toward the head of the column. The awakened warriors silently bowed as she passed, wishing her luck. Rain couldn't help but do the same. The Song army was bound to suffer casualties during the push to establish a fortified base on the collarbone of the dead deity. Looking at the powerful members of the Legion, she couldn't help but wish that all of them returned alive. At the same time, Rain couldn't help but wonder. Today, they were going to fight against nightmare creatures. What would she feel when the time finally comes for them to fight against people? The army assembled in a complicated battle formation. With so many soldiers, it was vast and unwieldy, mostly useless, but not entirely so. The Masters and Saints were going to assault the Vermilion Jungle, but the Awakened were prepared to fight as well. Obviously, they had very little chance of killing corrupted abominations, not to mention the great horrors who dwelt in Godgrave. However, they did not necessarily need to. The commanders of the Song army were well aware of the limitations facing their troops, so they had come up with various chilling but effective strategies. If it came to that, the task of the awakened soldiers was not to kill the powerful abominations, but to immobilize them. Although hard, that could be achieved with numbers alone. Even if an abomination had to be buried in human bodies, That was one way to deal with it. Of course, Rain felt a bit horrified by the prospect, just like all the other awakened warriors did. Still, it was not like the nightmare creatures would spare them otherwise, so they were prepared to carry out their orders and do their best, no matter the cost. Hopefully, that was not going to happen today. If the Saints and their ascended retinue succeeded in holding back the tide of nightmare creatures, it would not. The 7th Legion was positioned in the second line of the formation, so she could not even see the battle. All she could see were the tops of the strange and hideous plants swaying in the distance, and the backs of her fellow soldiers. She could also hear the sounds that the wind carried from somewhere far ahead. Next to her, Fleur trembled nervously and looked at Tamar.
It's starting, isn't it?
The legacy girl nodded somberly.
It is.
A few moments later, the sound of a horn rolled above the army, and the ground under their feet trembled slightly. Rain saw vague silhouettes moving forward from the front of the battle formation. The white surface of the ancient bone was still inclined, since they had not reached the collarbone yet, so she could not discern their shape clearly, but she knew that they were the Saints who had assumed their transcendent forms, as well as the larger of the nightmare creatures enthralled by Beastmaster. At the same time, the jungle came alive. She saw the red trees sway, but mostly, she heard and felt it. A harrowing choir of bestial roars and sounds too alien to be described with human language, washing over the massive army like a tide. The violent trembling of the ground as countless abominations rushed forward at the scent of human souls. She glanced at Tamar. For the rest of them, the fate of the Saints fighting on the front line was an abstract concept. The Saints were people whom they admired, looked up to, and maybe even knew, as well as the wall separating them from having to face the dreadful horde of nightmare creatures themselves. But it was different from Tamar, whose father was somewhere out there as well. The Saint of Sorrow was among the warriors whose task it was to make the tide of abominations stop. There were close to 2,000 masters in the Song army, but only around 40 transcendent champions. It did not seem like a lot, but at the same time, the world suddenly quaked. The world suddenly seemed to be on the verge of shattering. The violence of 40 Saints unleashing their transcendent power at the same time was staggering. Even far removed from the battlefield, Rain felt blood drain from her face. Next to her, Fleur swayed and leaned heavily on Ray. All around them, the awakened soldiers staggered. Only Tamar remained standing straight, seemingly undaunted. She did, however, look at the sky. As Rain's eyes widened, she did as well. Was the clash between the champions of the Song army and the creatures of the Vermilion jungle terrible enough to rip apart the veil of clouds? Luckily, it did not seem so. For now. The sounds of the battle grew much more loud, becoming almost deafening. Rain had to struggle not to raise her hands and cover her ears. To her shame, she found herself trembling.
Insane. Insane. This is insane.
The fear that had risen from some deep primal part of her was almost too powerful to overcome. The inability to see what exactly was happening out there, ahead, only made it worse. After all, it was the unknown that was the most terrifying. All she could see were the backs of the awakened soldiers that stood in front of the 7th Legion in the formation. They were not faring any better than her. Some were shaking. Some had fallen to their knees. Some had dropped their weapons. There were those who did not, though. There were those who helped their comrades to stand up and supported them, gripping the hilts of their swords tightly. Rain wanted to be one of those brave souls as well. Assaulted by the terrible cacophony of battle, she looked down at her shadow. The sight of it instilled her with strength. Gritting her teeth, she raised a hand and patted Fleur on the shoulder. The delicate girl looked at her with frightened eyes.
Rani?
Rain smiled.
Relax. What's the worst thing that can happen?
Fleur's beautiful eyes widened.
What? Why did you say it out loud?
Tamar and Ray glared at her with resentment too. Rain grinned. She was still a bit of a stranger in this small cohort, so apart from Tamar, the other two members acted a little awkward around her. It was rare to see all three united in such a sincere display of emotion, and that emotion was pure outrage, not fear or anxiety. So, her job here was done. Rain looked ahead and sighed, although she might have overdone it. From what she could hear, the vanguard of the army had managed to stem the tide of the nightmare creatures. A furious battle was happening somewhere ahead. However, the Saints had not managed to stop all abominations. Just then, she heard a litany of human cries and saw bodies flying into the air. It was as if something massive slammed into the front row of the awakened soldiers at the head of the battle formation. Human blood spilled on the white bone. The war horn blared one more time, and the soldiers ahead of her moved forward. Rain shivered and gripped her bow tighter. Far ahead, a strange haze rose above the crimson jungle. It seemed like a haze at first, but soon she saw that it was a vast swarm of flying abominations rushing from the depths of Godgrave like a cloud.
Gods!
One of the awakened soldiers near them pointed at the swarm in horror. Rain sighed and looked at the members of her cohort apologetically. Her grin grew a little forced.
Well, I guess that's the worst thing that could have happened.
On the other side of the Titanic skeleton, the Ivory Island was surrounded by a sea of nightmare creatures. The horde of them flowed forward, tearing the scarlet jungle apart. The jungle itself was moving too. Vermilion vines were crawling and rust-red flowers were blooming, releasing clouds of flesh-eating pollen. It was as if the whole world had come alive to devour the invading humans. The humans, meanwhile, met the tide of abominations with sharp steel and the destructive power of their aspects. The Fire Keepers were skilled and formidable. Their discipline and morale were beyond reproach. Their cohesion and experience were unequaled. Countless nightmare creatures fell to their blades, torrents of blood being absorbed by the ancient bone. And yet, they were being pushed back. A force of 50 battle-hardened masters was truly fearsome, but most of the abominations they faced were of a higher rank than them. These creatures were also the cursed spawn of Godgrave, where nightmares had to fight and devour each other without reprieve for the infinitely small chance to survive. The surface dwellers were not the true horrors who hunted in the dim twilight of the Great Hollows, but they were also exorbitantly fierce and ferocious, even when compared to the usual demented frenzy plaguing all nightmare creatures. The horde was vast as well. Granted, the Fire Keepers had been forged and sharpened by the Forgotten Shore, and so facing abominations that were more powerful than them was more or less their specialty. But still, there was one reason why they were able to hold out. Two reasons, actually. One was Changing Star of the Immortal Flame Clan. The other was the Lord of Shadows. It had been a long time since Sunny was truly able to unleash himself. Right now, he was like a dark hurricane that moved across the battlefield, surrounded by a vast mantle of flowing shadows. He neglected to manifest any of his shells, using only his two hands and the black Odachi to cut the abominations down. Everywhere he went, severed bodies fell to the ground. Sunny was using shadow manifestation to control the surrounding area and Shadow stepped to move around it, dancing between the nightmare creatures as his blade reaped their lives. While wielding Serpent as a weapon, his essence was replenished with every life he took. The faster he killed the abominations, the more essence he received, and could therefore burn. And the more essence he burned, the more enemies he could slay. Reaching a dangerous equilibrium in that manner, Sunny rampaged on the battlefield like the epicenter of a vast whirlpool of blood, darkness, and death. Of course, it was not easy. The corrupted nightmare creatures were falling easily to his blade, but he could be just as easily overwhelmed by them. All it took was a single mistake. But Sunny did not make any mistakes. Despite the startling speed at which he moved around the battlefield, despite the daunting complexity of navigating it with no regard to the familiar constraints of linear space, despite the burdensome task of maintaining both the lethal dance of slaying steel and the flowing storm of manifested shadows, Sunny's mind remained cold and clear, aware of every little detail of his surroundings, and full of merciless killing intent. He did not allow the dire mayhem of the battle and the intoxicating stench of death to pull him into a state of battle frenzy. No matter how brutal and unbridled his slaughter seemed, it was instead a result of precise and callous calculation. There were no emotions in his heart, no distraction in his mind. There was only clarity and will, the will to see his enemies dead. Nephis was fighting on the other side of the Ivory Island. Sunny could not see her, but he could sense her presence through the movement of shadows. In the world of shadows, her presence was as vast as that of the sun. She had unleashed a sea of incandescent flames, turning a swath of the battlefield into a searing inferno. The flames moved as if possessing a mind and hunger of their own, spreading through the horde of nightmare creatures like a plague. Where the power of the scorching flames was not enough, her sword fell like a herald of inescapable finality. At the same time, she was supporting the Firekeepers. When one of them received a wound, it was healed by the soft radiance of her soul flame. When one of them was on the verge of being swallowed by the tide of abominations, she was there to lend them the power of her incandescent blade. Cassia was participating in the battle as well. Her unseen presence was subtle, but played a pivotal role. She was not present on the battlefield, and no nightmare creature fell to her sword. However, she served as the connection between Sunny, Nephis, and the Firekeepers. She was aware of all and guided them all, helping them fight as a single being. She could also share the traits of the abominations with them, making the task of surviving the dreadful onslaught much easier. It was because of her that Nephis knew when one of her people needed support. The Firekeepers knew when to press forward and when to retreat. Sunny knew where the most dangerous enemies were and in which direction he had to move. Nephis was in command, but Cassia was the person who made sure that the commander had all the necessary information to make good decisions. Sunny had not seen the Firekeepers fighting a battle of that scale before, and now that he did, he was quietly impressed. He knew many who were more powerful than them, and a few who were more skilled than them, but he struggled to think of another group of warriors who were capable of showcasing this level of cohesion, combat awareness, and effectiveness in battle. That being said, it was still not enough. It did not matter how skilled and brave the Firekeepers were, or how unreasonably powerful he and Nephis had become. At the end of the day, they were still fighting against impossible odds. There were simply too many nightmare creatures, and each of these nightmare creatures was too powerful. Sending 50 masters and 3 saints to face an entire death zone was a suicidal task. They could not even retreat because they were surrounded from all sides. However, this time, Clan Valor had not sent Nephis into battle, hoping that she would die. They desperately needed her to survive, for a while at least. Sunny sensed it before he saw it, an invisible but undeniable change that spread across the battlefield. He was not affected himself, but the Firekeepers certainly were. They did not grow stronger, and their swords did not become sharper, and yet Suddenly, more nightmare creatures were falling to their blades. More blood was flowing to the ground, but less of it belonged to humans. Observing the inexplicable change through shadow sense, Sunny couldn't help but feel a deep sense of confusion. There was no reason for the sudden shift in the cadence of the battle, but it had shifted, without a doubt. Lacking any other explanation, he was tempted to think that it was a result of luck, but there was something deeper that was going on. He continued the wanton slaughter, defending one side of the Ivory Island. At the same time, he was standing on the grass of the island, near the marvelous mimic, observing the battle idly, side by side with Eiko. It was that incarnation of his that tried to understand what was happening. Almost an entire minute passed before his eyes suddenly narrowed. Sunny exhaled slowly.
I see.
The Firekeepers were not lucky. They had not grown stronger, and their weapons had not become sharper. It was just that they were fighting better. Their already impressive coordination had improved, reaching an almost inhuman level of perfection, and their battle sense seemed to have become even keener. It was as if they were possessed by a spirit of war and had received its blessing. He had seen something similar once before, albeit in a less pronounced way. It was during the Battle of the Black Skull. Back then, Morgan had armed her soldiers with enchanted swords forged by her father. Wielding those swords, the warriors of valor showed a strange level of cohesion, making it seem as if her entire army was one vast, lethal being. Back then, Sunny had guessed that the swords served as conduits for Anvil's authority, as vessels of his will, and therefore of his domain. And now, his domain had spread to Godgrave. After all, that was the entire reason why the Ivory Island was so important to Valor's plan of subjugating this cursed land and winning the war. The entire war was, at its heart, a race to conquer local citadels and allow the sovereigns to express their power here. At the end of it all, the Supreme who controlled more citadels in Godgrave and could therefore manifest their domain in a more profound way would have a great advantage in the battle against the enemy. The Queen of Worms was still powerless in this dreadful land, since there was nothing to summon her authority here. But Clan Valor had Nephis and her flying citadel as well. That was why they had tolerated Sunny's defiant unwillingness to surrender the Nameless Temple to them. And that was why they were already winning. Because unlike Keysong, Anvil could already express his power in Godgrave, and he was expressing it now. It had already spread in the vast area around the Ivory Island and rooted itself in the ancient bone under the cloudy sky, empowering his subjects. That was why the Firekeepers were suddenly more effective in the fight against the nightmare creatures. And that was why the Sword Army would have far less trouble entering the Scarlet Jungle. The spot where the Ivory Island landed had been chosen carefully to make sure that the king's authority covered the army's approach. But that was not all. Sunny shivered, suddenly overwhelmed by a cold presence. Turning around, he looked up at the balcony of the Ivory Tower.
No way.
There, a tall figure in dark armor stood, a vermilion cloak fluttering in the wind. A crown made out of dull steel rested on his head. The King of Swords had arrived to Godgrave. Then, the world was consumed by a scarlet storm. Countless sparks enveloped the Ivory Island and the sky above it, swirling like a hurricane of scarlet light. There were so many of them that it seemed as if the whole world was suddenly desaturated of all colors, except for red. Then, the sparks formed into a sea of rustling swords. An endless river of them blotted out the sky, moving in strange hypnotic patterns. Mesmerized by the sight and drowning in their shadow, Sunny almost forgot about the figure of a man standing on the balcony of the Ivory Tower. The man did not move, but his cold gaze fell on the horde of nightmare creatures below. In the next moment, The storm cloud of swords exploded with a lethal hail. Countless swords rained down, making the bone plane shudder. Down below, Sunny's avatar lowered the black Odachi and froze. It was a terrifying feeling to see the steel sky fall on him, glistening with countless sharp tips. However, he did not have to feel fear. Although it seemed that the rain of swords would obliterate everything on the surface of the ancient bone, none of the falling blades struck him. Instead, they reaped a terrible harvest of lives, piercing every nightmare creature in sight. In just a few moments, the horde of them was eviscerated. Numerous abominations were violently impaled by the flying swords, while those that survived the first onslaught were either bloodied or petrified. Slow to escape the inevitable doom, none of the firekeepers had received even a scratch, though, despite the fact that many of them were now surrounded by a forest of swords. The swords did not stop moving. More of them rained from above, and those that were impaling the nightmare creatures tore free of the bleeding flesh, rising into the air and turning to point at new prey. Standing in the sea of blood, Sunny turned and looked at the distant balcony. He should have felt elated because the battle was ostensibly over, but instead, all he felt was a cold sense of unease. Sunny knew that one day soon, he would be the target of these flying swords.
What's the matter? It's just a sovereign.
For once, the words did not bring with them any levity. Lowering his gaze, he peered at the horizon. There, far away, the first of the vermilion banners appeared in the distance. The sword army had crossed over to the collarbone of the dead deity. The sword army entered Godgrave with relative ease. Of course, it was a tense and solemn day. The awakened warriors were pale with dread as they ventured into the scarlet jungle and crossed over from the humerus bone of the dead deity to the vast collarbone. They were in a death zone after all. However, the army barely suffered any casualties. Changing Star and her firekeepers had pulled the attention of the local nightmare creatures away and established a beachhead on the collarbone plain. Most importantly, they brought the authority of the king to this dire purgatory. Emboldened and empowered by his presence, the army marched on. The veil of clouds did not break, held together by the power of Skytide of the Whitefeather clan. The transcendent and ascended warriors repelled the sporadic attacks of remnant abominations without too much strain, and later, the King of Swords himself descended upon the battlefield using the Ivory Island as an anchor. Once the storm of swords manifested above the jungle, the battle was ostensibly over. The army cut a path through the predatory jungle, using the beautiful silhouette of the ivory tower to navigate it. By the time they reached the scene of slaughter, there were no abominations left for them to fight against. There were only numerous corpses and the rustle of countless swords swirling in the sky above. Instead, the task they faced was of a more mundane nature. They had to establish a camp and start fortifying it, building an impregnable fortress on the surface of the ancient bone. That fortress would serve as the staging ground for the rest of the military campaign in Godgrave. The Song army, however, fared much worse than that. Rain was staring at the ground with a tired expression. On the ground in front of her, the wind was playing with flakes of ash. She was staying completely motionless, and those flakes of ash had been a person not too long ago. Above her, an incandescent white void shone blindingly through the broken clouds. Her first day in Godgrave had been a long, bitter nightmare. The first battle the Song army had fought was a sobering experience. Led by the 7 princesses, the saints and the ascended warriors of the Song domain clashed with the horde of nightmare creatures and repelled it. The unimaginable violence unleashed by that clash made the world quake, but worst of all, some of it reached the battle formation of the awakened warriors. The casualties were not immeasurable, but they weren't negligible either. Perhaps because it was the first time the soldiers fought against the abominations of Godgrave, the strategies developed by the royal clan to breach the difference in ranks between them could not be deployed promptly or at all. That could improve as the army gained experience, but today, too many people died. Rain herself did not participate in the slaughter because the 7th Legion was positioned in the second line of the formation, where the battle had not reached. However, she could hear and feel the terrible mayhem of the desperate struggle happening ahead. Nevertheless, eventually, the battle ended. The vanguard obliterated the horde of the frenzied nightmare creatures. Those of them who had gotten past were immobilized and eventually cut down by the awakened soldiers. After the soul shards were harvested, the corpses of the abominations were pushed aside, and the bloodied army continued to ascend the arm of the dead god. Soon enough, they entered the jungle. The jungle itself was as much of a shock to the invading humans as the horde of nightmare creatures had been. Everything here was not what it seemed, but all of it was insidious, hungry, and chillingly deadly. The grass, the flowers, the vines, the trees, every single thing here wanted them dead. Those of the soldiers who had more experience exploring the Dream Realm did not seem too fazed, taking the dread of the Scarlet Jungle in stride. But those who were younger and less experienced, like members of Tamar's cohort, were left shaken. Their mental fortitude was sorely tested, and that was after having already received a painful blow by the recent clash against the vast horde of abominations. If there was one silver lining to the situation, it was that the abominable flora of Godgrave was not as impervious to being damaged by the awakened as the corrupted nightmare creatures were. It was still incredibly tough and tenacious, but they could at least try to contend against the myriad of deadly dangers hiding in the jungle, so they did not feel as helpless at least. There were still many that died. Some died screaming after inhaling a bit of drifting pollen, falling to the ground, then wailing and convulsing as their bodies gruesomely became fertile soil for sprouting blossoms. Some died after being stung by tiny insect-like vermin that crawled into their armor. The effect of the paralytic poison was instantaneous, making the victims fall down without making a sound. However, it was unclear if they remained conscious and felt excruciating pain when the eggs deposited by the vermin into the wounds started to hatch a dozen seconds later. Some were strangled and drained of blood by thorned vines that hid beneath the vermilion moss. Some were pulled below it by what had looked like harmless patches of scarlet grass. It was all like a ghastly nightmare. Rain would have thought that they were invading the very depths of hell, if not for the fact that the Dream Realm was much more harrowing than any hell imagined by a human could ever be. Luckily, she had no time to drown in terror. The army marched forward in a vast battle formation. The train was absorbed into the formation and protected in its center, while the various legions and divisions turned defending the outer perimeter. The entire arrangement was spearheaded by the thralls of Beastmaster, who faced the most dire peril and suffered the heaviest casualties. On the flanks, the warriors of higher ranks dealt with the brunt of the danger once again, but awakened soldiers like Rain also had a lot to do, both when marching on the outer rim of the formation and when resting closer to its center. She had killed plenty of scurrying pests with her arrows, saving not only her life, but also that of others. Her arrows seemed to not know how to miss, striking down even the smallest pests with daunting precision long before they could sink their stingers, mandibles, and beaks into human flesh. In truth, she was a bit safer in this hellish place than most awakened were. It was because she could sense the movement of shadows, and therefore detect dangerous movement even if her sight betrayed her. And yet, Rain was swiftly growing tired, exhausted even. It was not because of marching or having to draw her bow over and over again. It was not even because of having to climb the steep slope of the dead god's humorous bone without rest. It was due to the mental strain of enduring the horror of Godgrave without allowing herself to break down. Rain had thought that she was accustomed to the dread of the Dream Realm after hunting in the wilderness around Ravenheart for 4 years, but now she realized just how tame those settled regions of this terrible world were after being conquered and cleansed by the previous generations of awakened. Compared to Godgrave, Ravenheart was a paradise. She was barely holding on to her composure, if not to her sanity. But even then, after a while, the march became easier. Humans were supremely adaptable after all. The jungle did not change, but the soldiers of the Song Army had adapted to its gruesome reality. At least a little bit. Eventually, they reached the mountainous shoulder joint that had connected the Titanic humerus to the collarbone. The engineering corps swiftly established a robust bridge under the protection of the 1st Army Legion. And then, the Song Army slowly started to cross over to the other side of the bottomless chasm. The crossing was perhaps the most perilous step of the invasion of Godgrave. Rain felt incredibly tense while the 7th Legion waited for its turn to enter the bridge. However, in the end, they reached the collarbone plain without any trouble. The jungle on the other side was much the same, but somehow everyone felt safer. That feeling was a lie. No sooner than the last division had crossed over, a strong wind rose and a loud wailing of a war horn washed over the entire army. That horn was different from the ones that had called them to battle, and much more anxious. "Don't move!" Tamar's shout was quite timely. The members of her cohort remembered the meaning of the wailing horn, despite their fatigue and mental exhaustion, but many of the surrounding soldiers were slow to react. Hearing her voice, they recalled their training. The entire army suddenly grew still. A few moments later, the world was suddenly much brighter. The light reflecting from the white surface of the ancient bone was almost painful to look at, as a wave of unbearable heat crashed into the human invaders, and the smell of ash filled the air. The jungle burned. Many humans burned too. Well, perhaps burning was not the right word. They just turned to ash, scattering into a cloud of gray flakes in the scorching wind, and disappeared without a trace. Not everyone had ceased all movement in time, and not everyone managed to remain perfectly motionless. Seeing their comrades die, some soldiers recoiled or flinched. They became ash too. Rain could not move, could not look away, and could not even wipe the flakes of warm ash off her face. All she could do was stand still and stare at the ground.
It's bitter.
The first day in Godgrave was too bitter to swallow. They had not even clashed with the army of the Sword Domain, and so many people were already dead. Yes, their number was inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but their deaths were not. Rain couldn't help but feel as if they had been beaten without even entering a battle. She was tired. After a few hours and more deaths, the veil of clouds finally repaired itself. The Song Army took a short rest, most soldiers sitting on the ground quietly, despondent and unable to say anything. Then they continued the march. By evening, or whatever constituted evening in this eternally sunlit hell, they finally reached the area where the army base camp was supposed to be established. Not everyone had made it that far, but for those who had, the war was only starting. The camp of the Sword Army resembled a fortified city that was like a dark stain on the sun-bleached surface of white bone, adorned by a sea of scarlet banners. The vicious jungle had been pushed back and incinerated some days ago, and was only now spreading tentatively from the fissures of the Titanic collarbone. Tendrils of red moss could be seen here and there, looking like patches of rust on the vast expanse of the bone plain. The sky above was gray and cloudy, yet suffused with blinding light. Tall walls surrounded the sprawling avenues of the base camp, and protected by their impregnable barrier, countless barracks and tents crowded the relatively limited space. The camp was a cauldron of activity, with thousands of soldiers going about their business in a tense atmosphere. When one looked at the fortress of the Sword Army, they could hardly imagine that it had not existed just a week ago. However, it was true. The entire city had been built in a matter of days, not decades or centuries. That was what hundreds of thousands of Awakened were capable of when brought together by a common goal. There were many among them who possessed potent utility aspects, and many more who could lend their physical strength and unique abilities to hasten construction. So the city had risen from the ground with a speed that was in no way inferior to how fast the Scarlet Jungle grew and propagated after being reduced to ash. There were two towering landmarks in the sprawling fortress. One was the Ivory Island, which hovered a few meters above the ground, anchored to it by 7 colossal chains to remain completely still. The beautiful white pagoda standing on its soil was like a beacon of hope for the soldiers of the Sword Army, raising their spirits every time they saw it. The other was the dark rift of the Dream Gate, which tore the fabric of reality apart some distance away. The King of Swords had moved it from Bastion to Godgrave, announcing to the world the gravity of his intent to see the rulers of the Song Domain pay for their transgressions. Currently, fresh supplies were arriving at the camp from the waking world. Sunny looked at the flurry of activity with a frown. It was tremendously convenient, of course, to have a direct logistical connection to the waking world here in Godgrave. The Song Army lacked that advantage still, which was why they had to scavenge provisions in the jungle or wait for heavily guarded convoys to deliver them across the Moonriver Plain and up the left arm of the dead deity. The road Rain had helped build drastically shortened the time needed for each convoy to arrive, true, but it was still a point of vulnerability, one that he personally would be exploiting in the near future, perhaps by launching raids to break the supply chains established by the Song Army. That was one of the duties the Lord of Shadows had agreed to, after all. Nevertheless, he did not like the presence of the Dream Gate here in Godgrave, not because it was particularly unnerving, but simply because it was a point of vulnerability as well. It was just that the vulnerability lay in the waking world, not in the dream realm. The servants of the Queen could not cross the vast collarbone of the dead god, lay siege to the king's fortress, and destroy the supplies arriving through the Dream Gate. However, they could easily stage a devastating attack on Valor's distribution forces in the waking world, not caring about the collateral damage and widespread destruction such an assault would entail. There was actually a mutual agreement between the two warring sides to keep the bloodshed contained to the dream realm. No one wanted for the soldiers to be afraid that their physical bodies would be destroyed while they were fighting the war. No one wanted for their families to be put in danger while they were on the battlefield either. The government was supposed to ensure that neither side broke the agreement. However, Sunny wasn't sure how long that agreement would last. He was even more doubtful that the government would be able to do anything if the mayhem of the Domain War spilled into the waking world. If anything, such an eventuality seemed all but inevitable. Shaking his head, he looked away from the Dream Gate and hurried his steps. No matter his opinion, he could not be late today.
This is not going to be strange at all.
Wearing the vermilion cloak of a Valor Knight, he was following Nephis and Cassia to the center of the camp. A few firekeepers were there as well, clad in their armor. Everyone they passed greeted them with admiration and reverence. At the same time, Sunny was heading in the same direction from the outskirts of the camp, his body encased in the stone-like metal of the onyx mantle, his face hidden behind the fearsome visage of Weaver's mask. Saint was walking behind him, indifferent crimson flames burning behind the visor of her helmet. The glances thrown at them were full of fear and apprehension. Today, Sunny was meant to attend a war council where the next actions of the Sword Army would be decided, in 2 different incarnations, no less. The prospect sent his mind for a spin. The Lord of Shadows was a natural choice to participate in such a meeting, of course. Both his power and status were more than great enough to earn him a spot at the table. But Master Sunless ended up being invited to the council by pure happenstance. It was simply because his status as a knight commander, no matter how bogus, was still technically a real one. Therefore, he had been incredibly surprised to receive orders to attend the strategy meeting, along with other notable officers of the Sword Army. It was both funny and concerning. At this rate, he might actually end up leading the Warriors of Valor into battle. The probability was infinitely small, but not entirely impossible.
Let's hope something like that won't happen. I really don't want to end up as a hero of the sword domain because of some ridiculous misunderstanding.
Just then, they finally reached the stone stronghold that stood at the heart of the camp, towering above every structure except for the ivory tower and the Dream Gate, and resembling a castle. The stronghold was where Anvil of Valor, the King of Swords, held court. One would have expected that he would stay in the comfort of the only citadel the sword domain possessed in Godgrave, and Nephis had even been prepared to surrender her living quarters at the top of the ivory tower to her adopted father. But Anvil chose to reside in a simple tent while the camp was being constructed, and then moved to his stone keep. Sunny could not complain. It would have been quite weird to have Neff's father, albeit a fake one, live under one roof with them, especially when they were often getting busy with. His thoughts were interrupted when his other avatar arrived in front of the stronghold. Sunny stared at the enigmatic and unmistakably sinister figure clad in an onyx armor, the very air around it suffused with coldness and arrogance. At the same time, Sunny stared at a delicate young man wearing a vermilion cloak on top of an elegant black mantle, his handsome face practically screaming of softness and lack of strength. He remained motionless for a few seconds, and then thought,
Edgy idiot. Pampered fool.
There was a bit of an eerie pause as Sunny stared at himself from behind the mask. The Lord of Shadows stared. Master Sunless, or rather, Sir Sunless, paled under his menacing gaze. Nephis looked at the two of them with a strange expression. Eventually, it was Cassia who broke the silence.
Greetings, Lord Shadow. I don't think we had an opportunity to meet in the last few days. Please, allow me to express gratitude on behalf of Lady Nephis and the Firekeepers. Your help in the recent battle, while unexpected, was deeply appreciated.
Sunny turned his cold gaze to her. He remained silent for a few moments, then said evenly,
There is no reason to thank me. I was just attracted by the smell of slaughter. Who can resist the beautiful fragrance of bloodshed?
The Firekeeper seemed more than a little troubled by his strange words. Sunny spared them a glance, then lowered his head slightly.
Greetings to you as well, Lady Nephis. Lady Cassia.
Then he looked at himself coldly. Was now a good time to establish a distinction between the Lord of Shadows and Master Sunless? It wouldn't hurt. He asked evenly,
And who might this be?
Nephis blinked a couple of times. She seemed a little puzzled by the situation. Not only did her suitor possess several incarnations, but two of them were even having a conversation right in front of her. More than that, the conversation did not seem especially friendly. Sunny himself was a bit confused about the nature of his peculiar existence, so Nephis must have been positively perplexed. Her attempts to hide her puzzlement behind the usual impassive expression were quite cute. He smiled behind the mask.
Oh, this is Master Sunless, an enchanter employed by the Firekeepers. Sir Sunless, this is Saint Shadow, a transcendent warrior of great renown, one of the champions of the Sword Army.
Sunny stared at himself some more, then shrugged dismissively.
An enchanter? Never heard of him. He must not be very good.
Hearing the Lord of Shadows say that, Master Sunless smiled. His smile was a little forced, though. He said politely,
Really? But I have heard of you.
Nephis was alternating between looking at them with a hint of bafflement in her eyes. The Lord of Shadows glared silently.
What did you hear? And from whom?
Sunny's smile widened a little.
I think I heard it from Saint Athena. She mentioned that you must be terribly hideous behind that mask.
The fire keepers held their breaths. Nephis seemed to have suddenly remembered that conversation and closed her eyes with a subtle wince. Cassia did not show a reaction, but it looked like she was trying to suppress a laugh. The Lord of Shadows lingered for a moment, then scoffed.
That woman certainly does sound like a handful. She has never seen my face, and yet she sings my praises.
With that, he turned away and walked into the gates of the stronghold without looking back. Sunny, Nephis, Cassia, and the fire keepers were left behind in tense silence. The coldness left behind by the Lord of Shadows was slow to dissipate. After a few moments, one of the fire keepers patted Sunny on the shoulder and gave him a thumbs up.
I admire you, Sir Sunless. You truly are a brave man. I would have never dared to talk back to that devil.
Another nodded.
True, that guy is beyond creepy, and he stared at Our Lady like a wolf every time they met. Good job, Sir Sunless.
A third one sighed.
Still, try not to antagonize him. He is immensely powerful, even among saints. It's better not to make an enemy out of someone like him.
Sunny coughed.
How come I am both pleased with and offended by their nonsense? Yes. I'll try not to. Next time.
Nephis, meanwhile, was looking at them in confusion.
Huh? What do you mean, stares like a wolf?
The fire keepers glanced at each other.
Sorry to tell you this, my lady, but I think you're the only one who has not noticed. The way he looks at you, it's, as if he wants to gobble you up.
She hesitated for a few moments, seemingly unsure how to respond. Eventually, she asked, "You think he's a cannibal?" Sunny struggled between the impulse to cover his face with a hand and the desire to give her a hug. He wasn't one to point fingers in that regard, but really, how could she be so adorably clueless?
I mean, she can literally sense people's desire.
One of the fire keepers coughed.
No, that's not. Anyway, why are we gossiping about the Lord of Shadows? We have Master Sunless right here. Unlike some people, he's a perfect gentleman and always maintains proper decorum when gazing at Our Lady.
Another nodded.
Yeah, if anything, it's Our Lady that stares at him like a wolf.
Realizing that he said something wrong, the firekeeper fell silent and cleared his throat.
Well, aren't we going to be late to the War Council? Let's proceed post-haste.
Nephis gave Sunny a curious look and then smiled with a corner of her mouth.
All right, let's go.
When the firekeepers headed for the entrance, she fell back, waited until the two of them were a few steps behind the others, and whispered into his ear,
"So, you want to gobble me up, huh?"
Sunny made his best effort not to trip. After maintaining silence for a few moments and regaining his composure, he smiled pleasantly and asked,
Why? Are you on the menu?
Nephis studied him silently, then chuckled and hastened her steps, leaving him without an answer. His expression crumpled a little.
No, but I really want to know.
Walking into the stronghold, Sunny touched his ear and let out a heavy sigh. Sometimes he really wished that everyone were beholden to the same flaws he was. Sunny, as the Lord of Shadows, reached the council chamber before his original body did. The room was not quite as impressive as the hall where the King of Swords had gathered all the saints before the war, but it was also quite spacious. The walls were built from gray stone and adorned with vermilion tapestries, and there was a round table in the middle of the chamber, with 42 chairs positioned around it. An elaborate enchanted chandelier shone with a cold glow above. There were already plenty of people gathered inside, and all of them turned to look when Sunny walked in. The Lord of Shadows was still a mystery to most of them, and although the rumors of his fearsome power had already spread far and wide, few knew what to make of him. Mostly they treated him with a mix of respect and wariness. He graced them with an indifferent gaze and then walked to the table. No one had taken their seat yet since the king was not present. Ignoring the unspoken convention, Sunny chose a random chair and sat down.
Pathetic.
His shadow chair was superior to this pitiful thing in all regards. Hidden behind the mask, he secretly studied the people who had been summoned to attend the War Council. There were many masters and a few awakened here, but they were mostly meant to observe the discussion and provide insight if any of the true decision-makers had a question having to do with their expertise. The people of real importance were the saints, and they were the ones Sunny was curious about. Most of them hailed from the vassal clans, while some were retained by valor. Several were members of the royal clan's branch families as well, albeit not many. The Sword Army possessed slightly more than 40 transcendent warriors. It was less than the Song domain had, but the Saints of Valor were forged from tougher steel. Or at least that was what the public believed. They had more renown, a longer history, and had accomplished more incredible feats. However, Sunny was doubtful that they were truly superior to the transcendent warriors of the Song Army. After all, some of the strongest saints he knew were of those that few people had ever heard about or cared to pay attention to. So he had a feeling that the champions of the Queen of Worms would give their enemies a nasty shock when the two armies finally clashed in battle. Which was not to say that the people gathered in the chamber weren't outstanding in every regard. A saint was a saint, after all. Even now that transcendents were somewhat divided into tiers, everyone understood that those tiers only differentiated between various levels of absolute excellence. He saw a few familiar faces, of course. There was Morgan, the Princess of War, the sharpest sword of her father's kingdom. The enchanting beauty was clad in black armor, leaning on a wall as she studied the room with a hint of amusement in her vivid vermilion eyes. There was Nephis, changing star of the Immortal Flame clan. Even among these legendary figures, she was treated with a hint of veneration, both because of her family and because of her own accomplishments. Sunny knew how tyrannical her power was better than anyone. Looking at the two princesses, Sunny had a sudden thought. He found it ironic. There were 7 saints among the girls Kisong had adopted, while Anvil only had 2 transcendent children. And out of those 2, one was now fighting on the side of the enemy, while his place was taken by the daughter of a man the sovereigns had most likely killed.
That's one messed up family tree.
He continued to study the gathered saints. There was Cassia, the blind seer. People paid attention to her because of her startling beauty and quiet demeanor, but few understood how dangerous she was. Most knew her as a competent advisor of the royal clan, while some treated her with subtle reverence that was often afforded to oracles. But since she was not too accomplished as a warrior, no one held her in truly high regard. Then there was Sunny himself, the Lord of Shadows. People seemed to have various opinions about him, but everyone agreed that he was an extremely formidable combatant. Still, there was a certain feeling of distance between him and the rest of the gathered saints. as if they were not entirely ready to put their trust in a stranger. That was because his position was somewhat unique. Unlike the rest of them, he had not sworn loyalty to the King of Swords, and was therefore more of a mercenary than a true comrade. Some distance away, Sonny noticed St. Tyrus. He saw her recently, so he was not too surprised by the fact that she had not changed at all in the last 4 years. Sky Tide had always had a stern but strong presence. Now, however, everyone seemed to treat her with an extra bit of respect. After all, she was one of the most important strategic assets in this war. Strangely enough, the man standing next to her had not changed that much either. He was tall and rugged, with broad shoulders and an easy bearing. His hair and beard were the color of straw, while his eyes were piercingly blue. There was a blue scarf wrapped carelessly around his neck. Roan of Whitefeather had grown even more handsome after becoming a saint. Together they made for a beautiful pair. Awakened Tell was standing behind her parents. Sonny was pleased to see the belated apology on Roan's right forearm. It seemed that her father really liked her gift.
I'm glad.
On the opposite side of the chamber, a gallant man in lustrous armor was waiting calmly for the meeting to start. He was Sir Gilead, the Summer Knight, a man whose loyalty and noble character were a legend in and of themselves. He was known for his straightforward nature, embodying qualities such as honor, valiance, and devotion. Although, after spending some time with the man in the Nightmare Desert, Sonny suspected that there was more to Sir Gilead than blind loyalty. In any case, Summer Knight was one of the strongest and most renowned transcendent warriors of the old generation. He was, more or less, the personification of what people thought a saint should be. Having someone like that fighting by one's side was quite reassuring in a dire war. These were all the gathered transcendents Sonny knew personally. However, there were a few more that he instantly recognized from hearing about them here and there. There was a dashing man wearing a beautifully decorated suit of golden armor with floral motifs in the accents. He was Saint Rivalan of Aegis Rose, also known as Shield Wall, a distinguished knight known for his gallant demeanor and stalwart character. There was also an elegant older gentleman leaning on a black cane. He was Jest of the Dagonet clan, a former member of the cohort led by the founder of Clan Valor and one of the most experienced awakened of the Sword Army. Among other things, Saint Jest was known for his peculiar true name. Not so funny anymore. Sonny didn't really know what to make of that fact. However, he was quite curious about the older saint. They shared the bitter fate of having an extremely weird name after all. There were a few others as well. However, before Sonny could properly study them, the King of Swords arrived. The War Council was about to begin. When the king entered, everyone in the chamber straightened. Everyone except for Sonny, naturally, who was the only person sitting comfortably on a wooden chair. Anvil spared him a short glance, which was heavy enough to make Sonny pale behind the mask, and took his seat calmly. Once the King of Swords was seated, the rest of the saints took their places behind the round table. Because of its peculiar shape, everyone here seemed to be an equal. However, that equality was merely an illusion. Anvil did not do anything, and yet his suffocating superiority was painfully apparent. Consequently, those who sat closest to him were above the rest. Morgan sat to his right, while Nephis sat to his left. As for Sonny himself, he was almost on the other side of the table. At the same time, he was standing near the wall with the rest of the firekeepers. The masters and a few awakened who had been invited to participate in the war council did not get a spot behind the table. There were a few moments of silence before Anvil's deep, strangely enthralling voice resonated in the stone chamber. He spoke evenly and plainly, in a strangely calm tone, as if what he was talking about was a mundane matter, not a war that would shape the future of humanity, or maybe even destroy it.
Welcome, warriors of the Sword Domain. We have carved out a piece of this cursed land and established a fortress atop the ancient bones of a dead deity. Our blades are sharp, and our will is triumphant. For now, the forces of Song have had a hard time achieving what we have achieved with relative ease. But there is no wisdom in belittling their valor. Those who underestimate the enemy are destined to fall. The cost of arrogance is death.
He gazed at them coldly and continued in an indifferent tone.
There is no one in the world who knows Qi Song, the Queen of Worms, better than I do. So I tell you this. There is no end to the insidious schemes woven by that woman. You should prepare yourself to taste bitterness as her machinations unfold. However, I also promise you this. At the end of it all, we will taste the sweetness of victory.
Hearing those words, Sunny couldn't help but sigh. At that moment, he suddenly realized how tragic this war must have seemed to the rest of humanity, for reasons entirely different from the ones he himself had considered before. Anvil said that there was no one in the world who knew Qi Song better than him, and it was most likely true. Sunny was used to thinking about these two as nebulous and sinister figures, as tyrants of immense power who secretly controlled the fate of humanity, the Sovereigns. But they had been mere mortals before attaining supremacy. Awakened warriors no different from him. More than that, they had been members of the same cohort. So this was a bitter war between two people who had once braved the horrors of the nightmare spell together and fought side by side in the depths of hell. It was no different from Sunny raising an army against Cassia to kill her and take her kingdom for himself.
It's actually quite sad.
These people had been the hope of humanity once. Now the smile of heaven was gone. Broken Sword was dead as well. Asterion was who knew where, and the last two were determined to destroy each other. It made Sunny wonder what would happen to his own cohort in the future. He could not know the future, of course, but he did know that, at the very least, they would never end up as the Sovereigns. Not the least of all because the Sovereigns were there, in front of them, as a cautionary tale. Without their appalling example, Sunny and his companions might very well have unknowingly ended up becoming them. He inhaled deeply and briefly glanced at Nephis. The King of Swords, meanwhile, continued.
Now that we have established a foothold in Godgrave, we must persist into its depths. The next stage of our campaign will be both perilous and vital. Fortunately, I am here. I am with you. So, who can be against you?
Those were big words, but he was also someone who could speak them without sounding boastful. After that, Anvil succinctly explained the goals looming over the Sword Army. Sunny ignored the flowery words and listened only to the underlying message that the Sovereign of Valor wanted to relay. Fundamentally, the Domain War was a clash between the King of Swords and the Queen of Worms. It would reach its culmination when the two of them faced each other in battle, and end when one of them killed the other. The key to gaining a decisive advantage in that final confrontation were the citadels scattered across Godgrave. Possessing more of them would allow one of the Sovereigns to manifest their domain more thoroughly and make that domain stronger. Therefore, the two great armies were merely tools for taking control of the citadels. Valor was already ahead of Song in that regard, and there seemed to be nothing that could prevent them from widening the gap. With their sovereign present in Godgrave, the task of subjugating lost citadels would become much easier, which was not to say that it would be easy. Although the King of Swords could already manifest his domain here, his power was still contained in the immediate area around the Ivory Island. That allowed the camp of his army an incredible degree of protection against external threats, and made the task of venturing into the subterranean jungle less daunting. But the warriors of Valor still had to brave the incinerating expanse of the surface and the dark depths of the hollows to uncover and conquer the overgrown citadels. As for where those citadels were located, at some point, Anvil paused for a few moments and shifted his gaze to the masked figure sitting on the other side of the round table. His voice was calm when he said,
"Regarding this matter, I will ask the person who knows most about Godgrave to give us an explanation. Saint Shadow, if you will."
Sunny lingered for a bit, then sighed and leaned forward a little.
Sure, let's see. For a godforsaken hell unfit to be inhabited by humans, Godgrave has a surprising number of citadels.
The King of Swords certainly had a commanding presence, but when the Lord of Shadows spoke, it was hard not to pay attention to him as well. Both possessed a cold indifference to them, but while Anvil's voice was calm and regal, Sunny's was sinister and dark. The impenetrable darkness nestling in the eyes of his ferocious mask only made him seem more eerie and captivating. Leaning forward a little, he spoke in an even tone. Or rather, he pretended to. In truth, he simply activated the enchantment of the extraordinary rock and allowed it to repeat what he had spoken aloud earlier, before summoning Weaver's mask.
There are no more citadels to be conquered on the surface, and I can't say anything about the Sea of Ash below. Even for me, that place is too dire. However, there are several strongholds hidden in the hollows, which I have scouted out extensively in the last few years.
Sunny pretended to pause for a moment, then moved his hand subtly. Following his command, shadows crawled from the floor and flowed onto the table like a stream of darkness. There, they solidified and manifested into a flawless model of the dead deity, a trick he had used once before in front of the Firekeepers. Soon, it was as if a large black skeleton was laying on the wooden surface of the council table. There was a wave of whispers in the stone chamber. Sunny allowed it to pass, and then continued coldly with the help of the extraordinary rock.
I know the approximate location of 4 citadels. One is situated in the western part of the Collarbone Hollow, and is the closest one to the war camp of the Song Army. Taking it would without a doubt become a priority to them, since they need to conquer a citadel desperately. The second is located in the central part of the Breastbone Hollow, at an equal distance from both of the war camps. Considering our advantage, we should be able to reach it first.
Sunny leaned back and crossed his arms.
The third is situated far below in the spine of the dead god. Reaching that one would be much more challenging. All of Godgrave is hell, but the Great Spine Hollow is one of the most dreadful parts of that hell by far. The fourth citadel is the furthest, and is hidden all the way in the far south, in one of the 2 femur hollows.
He lingered for a few moments, and then commanded the extraordinary rock to speak the last prepared lines.
I suspect that there is a 5th citadel as well. If there is, it is situated in the skull of the dead deity. However, that place is far too harrowing. I have never dared approach it, and I suggest that none of you try either. Whatever is hidden there should never be disturbed by humans.
Sunny had indeed never ventured close to the colossal skull of the dead god. even though it could be seen from anywhere in Godgrave, propped up by the mountains and staring at the ancient corpse with its enormous empty eyes. It was the last place he ever wanted to explore. Sure, the ancient darkness drowning the great chasms of the skeleton's eyes was nebulous and alluring, promising mysteries beyond his imagination, and maybe keys to unimaginable power. Who knew what could be hidden in the head of a dead deity? Maybe it was the secret of its death. But no matter what the secret was, it had to be something of tremendous importance. And yet, Sonny felt it in his own bones that trying to enter the colossal skull would result in a death more thorough than any he had brushed against before. He wouldn't be surprised if there was an unholy titan dwelling there, and he was not ready to face an unholy titan. Simply witnessing a creature like that could very well cause Sonny's mind to shatter and his soul to collapse. His final words were met by a tense silence. The gathered saints studied the black skeleton laying on the table with somber expressions. Eventually, Morgan asked in a subdued tone, "Saint Shadow, how sure are you that these locations you've discovered are indeed citadels and not simply ancient ruins?"
Sonny shrugged. "As sure as I can be."
In truth, he was reasonably certain, but there was always room for doubt. He had never explored the interiors of the supposed citadels, since there were immensely powerful abominations guarding each of them, but he had learned enough to believe in his judgment. Hearing his response, Morgan smiled. "How fortunate it is that my sister managed to convince you to share your knowledge, then." The King of Swords gazed at him once more, then spoke evenly.
"The course of action is clear. For now, it is too perilous to send our soldiers into the hollows. We need to proceed slowly by conquering the surface and make our way to the center of the breastbone plain. From there, we will launch an assault on the citadel situated below it."
That was just as expected. During this first stage of the war, both armies would be preoccupied with the laborious task of subjugating the surface of Godgrave. They would move deeper inland, eradicating the jungle and mapping out the major fissures in the ancient bone. Then, fortified outposts would be built near the fissures to stop the jungle from crawling out of the hollows once again, thus slowly expanding the zone of human control. It seemed like a titanic task, to conquer the colossal skeleton, one crack in the bone at a time. But Sonny was not stupid enough to underestimate the tenacity of the human pioneers. All regions of the Dream Realm had once seemed impregnable, and yet humans had slowly conquered them, one after the other. Clan Valor in particular was responsible for subjugating the vast territory between the Twilight Sea and the Hollow Mountains. The story of their expansionist crusades was the stuff of legends in and of itself. And while humanity had never conquered a death zone before, its expedition forces had never been as vast, and had never been led by rulers of the supreme rank either. So Sonny had no doubt that the surface of Godgrave would fall into human hands eventually. Perhaps it would take many months and cost countless lives, but the result had already been decided. The sovereigns had willed it, and so their wills would reshape the world to fit their ambitions. He looked at the King of Swords, and at the same time, the king looked at him. Anvil remained silent for a moment, and then said without any emotion in his powerful voice,
"Well, most of us will be paving the road south. You have another task, Saint Shadow."
Sonny raised an eyebrow behind the mask.
"Oh?"
The King of Swords shifted his gaze to the black skeleton, looking intently at the spot where the war camp of the Song Army was supposed to be. When he spoke, his tone contained authority that could not be denied.
"You will venture to disrupt the enemy's attempts to conquer the Western Citadel. The location of your own stronghold is quite convenient for launching raids, so I expect you to deliver good results.